Yeah, hi there, this is tuxoch.com again. Welcome on my video channel. In today's little video, we want to talk about a comparison of different HDR tools. With the final release of Luminar NEO, or better say HDR Merge, there's another tool which can merge different exposure bracketing to a single HDR image. However, Skylum decided to make HDR merge costly, so you have to pay 49 euros to buy the extension only if you licensed Aurora HDR or you licensed Luminar NEO in a subscription model. Then the HDR merge module is free of charge. If we take a look on this symbol here in Luminar NEO for the HDR merge extension, I guess Skylum is planning a couple of extensions, which I guess should be one that you have to pay for, as you can see here in the screenshot. As you know, I had a pre-release version of the HDR merge module and I had a couple of problems. But now, after testing the final version, I can tell you that none of the problems I mentioned, that is either crashes of the application or weird metadata, would appear in the final release version, even though Skylum only updated Luminar NEO itself and not the HDR merge module. But now, since HDR merge is in the final release, even though it's a little bit slower, we could take this one and other programs to make a comparison for the HDR merge tools or implementations in the different applications. In particular, I want to make a comparison between the following programs. That is Photoshop CC, Lightroom Classic, Luminar NEO or HDR Merge, of course, Photomatix, and SNS-HDR Lite, which is a free of cost console program which I used for quite some time. The criteria for those programs are, of course, the price, handling and ease of use, aligning of the images, deghosting, and maybe if there are some other options for improving the HDR image. Okay, let's have a look on the first one, and this one should be Photoshop CC.
Okay, I got here 3 images, base images, which are now handled over to Adobe Photoshop, like this. And since there are RAW files, it will certainly open up Adobe Camera RAW, like this. But I don't want to alter any setting here. I just want to handle them over to Photoshop. Say open. Now it will load those files into Photoshop CC. Like this, and now we can say File, Automate, and Merge to HDR Pro, and we of course can select the already open file, do that, and now we can merge those to an HDR image. And here you got the sort of a preview of the image, and that looks pretty saturated. Here we got the default settings. Of course, I could click here on remove ghost, but I don't have any ghosting in this images for sure. And here I could alter some settings depending contrast, saturation, and so on. But okay, I wanted to generate the HDR with the default settings, so we say okay. Okay, I hope you can see the difference. There is no chance for the preview. That is not anything like the preview we saw. So that's just too bad, but we could do this another time. We just go here and maybe we'll go to Automate, Merge to HDR. Add the already open files. Maybe we choose another setting or the default setting. Okay, maybe we do like this one here, photorealistic low contrast, and you see here it's getting here pretty dull in the preview, but this might be okay. We'd click OK, and now we will merge the HDR, but that's had nothing to do with the preview Photoshop is presenting to me, so that is a reason for me not to use Photoshop in this comparison.
As you could see that loading the 3 base images of an HDR bracketing series will of course result in calling up Adobe Camera Raw. That's okay so far. But then you get the preview of the final HDR image where you can adjust some parameters like curves, saturation, contrast, and so on. But then the resulting image, which is presented to you by Photoshop CC, has nothing in common with this preview. And I did this comparison a couple of times with different images and of both on Windows systems and on my MacBook Air, and all the time it resulted in the same oversaturated HDR image, which I'm not used to. And the main reason is that it has nothing to do with the preview presented by Photoshop CC, so I decided to withdraw Photoshop CC from this comparison. Okay, the next one would be Lightroom, and let's take a look on the Lightroom implementation of HDR merge.
Here, and I have a couple of HDR base images here already in a catalog I exported from my regular catalog, and maybe we start, let's say with this one here. There are 5 images taken with the Lumix. We mark those images and say photo merge, and of course HDR, and then Lightroom is generating a preview that looks pretty cool. And what you can see here is that auto line is hit. That is even though this image, as far as I recall it, was taken from a tripod, but it doesn't hit or have any impact of the generating the HDR image, so I would check this just in case. The auto settings is for the import in Lightroom, and of course here you could, just like in Photomatix, create a stack and stack the resulting HDR image on top of the base images. And here you got the deghosting, but that here in this case we don't need the deghosting, so we just can go forward and hit merge. The merged image is now done as a DNG file, as you can see here. But there is one problem with the DNG, or better say HDR files in Lightroom. As you can see here in the settings, that the automatic settings Lightroom uses are a little bit decreased in the exposure, but a lot in the highlights and of course in the shadows. So I would reduce this manually, and that is because normally all the images are, at least in Lightroom, which I generated, in my opinion, a little bit too bright. But that so far is okay if you just process them a little bit and correct those settings, so you can work with this settings. Very good. Okay, let's go back to the library, and maybe we go to this one. That's another sequence I took with the Lumix, and this time we have to set the option for deghosting. But at first Lightroom is generating the preview, of course. We do auto line, we leave auto settings, but now, which is pretty cool I think, is that you can hit this one and then Lightroom will show you the areas of the image where deghosting will take effect. And then, since those persons are here part of the deghosting, you can pretty precisely judge which parts are deghosted, and now you can maybe play around with the three settings you got here, either low, medium, and high. And I did this before, of course, and I think that's that the high settings are requested by those kind of images. And again, we generate the HDR, and that is of course the DNG file. And as you can see here, that the deghosting here in Lightroom worked pretty good. But another problem, I think, I don't know if you recognize this because of the YouTube compression, that jacket here is a little bit noisy. It's okay, there's nothing bad about it. You can reduce this noise by noise reduction either in Lightroom or in other programs, but that is you have to bear in mind if you do ghost reductions on high ISO shots.
As you could see, Lightroom generates DNG files, which is quite okay. That's a sort of RAW file which you can process further in Lightroom or even Photoshop if you like. But if you switch to the development module, Lightroom, I think, tends to bring down the lights and open up the shadows quite some amount, and even in some images increases the exposure by one exposure value or even more. So your range for further processing the image is a little bit limited by this, in contrast to other programs. With this lightening up in Lightroom Classic, you might even run into noisy images even with a full frame camera. Re-importing the image, of course, into the catalog and even stacking it with the base images is, of course, no problem to Lightroom, because that's one of the base function of the program. The next one in the line would be, of course, Luminar NEO with the HDR module. So let's take a look on this one again on the laptop.
Luminar NEO with the new HDR merge module, and here you can see all the HDR images are already done with Luminar NEO. And just to mention it, I didn't occur the problems I had with the pre-release version, like with Canon files, that the application would crash totally, or that in some cases you get weird EXIF metadata and so on. Now with the official update to 1.2.0, this works pretty fine now. Okay, for the comparison, I got here the HDR base images, and maybe we do this one here. Mark those images, drag them over to the merge module, and here you got basically two, or better say three settings. That is auto alignment. I would check this all the time because it doesn't have that much influence on the time needed for the merge process. And the ghost reduction in this case is not necessary. So we just could go back and say merge the images to an HDR image, which as you already know if you viewed the other video, that Luminar NEO is generating a DNG file, as you can see here. That looks pretty neutral, and that is okay, but we drop this right away to the trash and go here to the base images catalog, and take those three images here, drag them over to the merge module, and talking about the settings, I would just hit the auto alignment. But now we want to do deghosting, because here are some persons moving around doing the capture taking, and now I do ghost reduction, and I can choose the amount. Regularly is set to medium, that might be okay. And what is important here is that you can select the base image for the deghosting, and I would take either the normal exposed image or try to get a nearly overexposed. If you choose the underexposed image, because of the HDR process, it might be resulting in noise because that's leveled up to same settings, and brightness, and may cause problems, especially with smaller sensor size camera. Okay, we hit OK, and then we merge this together. Here we got the file image, and as you can see here, the deghosting went out pretty well. So that is pretty fine and okay with Luminar NEO, and yeah, the default settings.
Luminar NEO generates DNG file also, just like Lightroom, but switching to the development module, it is not determinable if there are already some changes to exposure or open up the shadows or bringing down the lights in this case, because that is due to the fact how Luminar NEO handles development steps in the application. The application or HDR merge module still is relatively small, but that's so far okay. And I guess because it's the first version, Skylum will fix this in the next update. Okay, next one to look at is Photomatix HDR Pro, and let's take a look on this on the Windows PC.
Okay, now I opened Photomatix Pro, and we will drop over those 5 images here. They were taken with the Lumix camera. Just drop them into the window, and here we got the window which guides us through all the settings. Here you got the different exposures. As you can see here, that all the images were taken with the difference of 1 exposure stop in a bracketing series. Okay, next one we take is merge options. And here you can first set the alignment options. Per default, that is handheld standard. And because I took them from a tripod, I will leave it that way, but you already could use setting on tripod. That's probably that Photomatix won't do any alignment at all. Then next thing is here you got chosen or the option for deghosting, which will be done later. And you can use reduce noise or noise reduction. In this case, you have the choice of underexposed images only, the under and normal exposed and all images. And that is due to the fact that you're processing RAW files here. And the same is true for reducing chromatic aberration. And now you can even choose another white balance and so on. And then you go to the next point, and that is align the images and show the deghosting options. Okay, you got here the preview, and here you see an effect which I state on a couple of images, at least on the overexposed images with the Lumix G81. That might be an error in the RAW interpretation, but so far the image looks pretty good. And now here you can set the deghosting options. You don't have any fixed options. You can do that the way you need and the amount you need, of course. And since we don't need any deghosting here in this image, we go to the next one, press OK. And now here we got the preview of the ready image, and still you could choose one of those presets and add more saturation to the image and generate an HDR, which is quite colorful, you would call it. But in this case, that's just right, I think. And of course, you could set here the different settings for the tone comparison, white and black clipping, and of course you could set the saturation and so on. and the form of blending, but for this comparison we just want to use default settings, so we just hit the next one. And now you go to contrast, sharpening, and so on. If you want to do that and even straighten or crop the image, you can set all those settings to the image, and since we don't want to do that, you just hit done here. And now we can save the image, either, which I prefer, as a 16-bit TIFF file, but you could also choose a JPEG or other formats. And maybe we do another example, and that is here the sunset here. I just marked those images here in Lightroom, and Photomatix comes with a pretty good plug-in, I think. And you just set here the plug-in, and then you can choose how to align the images, or how Photomatix should align the images, how noise reduction should work. Of course, chromatic aberration is not set by default here in this example, because, okay, that should have been done in Lightroom, of course. And you have the opportunity to stack the resulting HDR file with the base images. And of course you have here the choice about the naming of the resulting file, and last but not least here the resulting file format. And surely, as I said before, I would prefer 16-bit TIFF. Okay, now we export those, and Lightroom of course will generate 16-bit TIFF files and handle them over to Photomatix, like you can see here. Okay, that's almost the ready image. That looks pretty good. And here you get the loop where you can place it over certain areas of the image to get a closer view, but at this we just say next. Now the images are merged, and now we could do a save and re-import. We do that. Now the image is saved at a 16-bit TIFF and automatically re-imported into Lightroom. As you can see here, that's the resulting TIFF file, and of course you could process this any further if you want to in Lightroom, Photoshop, or any other program.
Photomatix offers the opportunity to save your images either in JPEG. Okay, that's not mine because you can't process those images any further. And of course 8 or 16-bit TIFF files and some other formats, but I would prefer the 16-bit TIFF version, so you can process the image even further in a program of your choice. If you operate Photomatix as a plugin, the choices for the user are even more simple, and of course then the resulting HDR image is automatically imported into the Lightroom catalog, and if you set this option, it is stacked with the base images to a stack of images in the Lightroom catalog. Compared to Lightroom, as you could see, Photomatix of course has most of the processing options and a lot of presets which determine the look of the resulting HDR image. But now let's take a look on SNS-HDR Lite, a free version of a program I used a lot in the last time, mainly for architecture and landscape photography.
Okay, I again got here 3 base images. I think they were done with the Canon camera. We mark those and handle them over to SNS-HDR Lite. That is just a droplet. As you can see here, it's loading the images, aligning the images, and then merging them together to HDR, doing tone mapping. Now it saves the image here as a 16-bit TIFF file, and as you can see here, that looks pretty good. And the only thing I did in terms of settings is to add the parameters here, TIFF 16 and sRGB color space for rendering the images. So that's yeah, pretty short and pretty convenient result for SNS-HDR Lite. Maybe we do another one, maybe here from Funchal, or we do it Funchal, but you have to consider that SNS-HDR Lite doesn't have any deghosting. This time it has to load and align 5 images because that was bracketing done with the Lumix camera, and as you can see over here that the all CPU cores are pretty used, sufficient. All the 8 cores are used, so you have 16 thread almost at 100%. And here that is ready, and here you can see the result. That's, I think, pretty good. Okay, you got here some ghosting effects, but that is, as I explained, due to the fact that SNS-HDR Lite doesn't have any deghosting settings.
SNS-HDR Lite is yeah, as simple as that. It's a droplet only, and the only way or only parameter it takes is that you include the parameters TIFF16, so it results in 16-bit TIFF files. And of course, you don't have any other options with this program. The final HDR image is saved into that folder where the base images came from, so that's pretty convenient for your processing or your workflow. There was a plugin for this one, but the plugin is pretty outdated now, even though it might work or it might still work, but I don't use it anymore. I just use SNS-HDR Lite as a droplet, as shown here in the little video. Okay, let's come to the results. We make a simple table with the 4 programs, Lightroom, Luminar NEO, the HDR merge module, Photomatix, and SNS-HDR. Basically, all the tools deliver quite neutral images, I would say. There is a tendency that Lightroom produces the brightest images. Luminar NEO will result in pretty neutral in terms of exposure images, and SNS-HDR Lite and Photomatix seems to do a little bit of underexposure in the images, but there's nothing what you couldn't correct in the later image processing, so that's not a parameter to depend your choice on which program you might consider. Why now in 2 cases with SNS-HDR and Photomatix, the resulting image in the bright areas tend to tilt to magenta? I couldn't say. That were images from the Lumix G81 and only occurred in the overexposure part of the exposure bracketing, and occurred only if in this case where I took the original RAW files. I usually process those images first in Lightroom, export to 16-bit TIFF, and handle them over to SNS-HDR Lite, so I didn't have this problem in the past for generating HDR images. But nevertheless, now take the rating of the 4 applications, and let's start with the price, of course, because that is, if you're looking for a tool, might be the one parameter you look for. And here SNS-HDR Lite and Lightroom both get the highest rating of 5 points because they are free of additional charge, or free totally, like SNS-HDR. I want to put 3 points to HDR merge because regularly it would cost 49 euros as an extension. Only, as I mentioned, licensees for Luminar NEO in a subscription model, or if you licensed Aurora HDR first would get this extension free of charge. And because of its cost of 79 euros, Photomatix deserves only 1 point, of course, because it's the most expensive tool in this comparison. Now let's move to handling and ease of use. Okay, SNS-HDR Lite deserves, I think, 5 points, because the only thing you have to do is extend the parameter to TIFF 16, so the resulting images would be 16-bit TIFF files, which can be processed further in any other image processing tool. The other tools like Lightroom, HDR Merge, and Photomatix deserve all, I think, 4 points. Photomatix because, okay, it has a lot of options, but the user is guided through the different settings, and you can leave it to the default settings and still get pretty good results. In the worst case, you have to do it over again if, like, the setting for the ghosting or the setting for aligning the images was not strong enough. HDR Merge and Lightroom, of course, get 4 points too, because you have only two options, and that is clicking the alignment if the images were taken from a tripod or freehand, and you only have to click this setting for the ghosting effects in the HDR base images. And coming to align, SNS-HDR gets 5 points because this tool aligns all the images by default. You don't have to do any setting in this, so that means you can't forget it. All other programs will get 4 points in this category because you have to set it, but you only have to differentiate or to distinguish between those images taken from a tripod or if it took the images freehand. And you might as well hit align images all the time because it doesn't hurt either in processing or processing time. Let's move to the category removing ghost effects in the images. SNS-HDR, okay, gets only 0 points because it doesn't have any option for this, but that didn't make any difference to me because mainly I used it for architecture and landscape photography in the past, so I didn't have to use this option. Lightroom at this point gets 3 points because it has 3 different settings for the amount of removing ghost effects in the different HDR image, and Luminar NEO or the HDR module gets 4 points at this in this category because it has 4 different settings for this category for removing ghost effects. And last but not least, Photomatix get at this point 5 points because you have no fixed settings for removing ghost. It's a slider from 0 to 100, and you can determine very precisely which setting will be the best for your HDR image. Now we get to the possible options. Here again, SNS-HDR Lite just gets 0 points because there are no other options in this tool. And HDR Merge at this point gets 1 additional point because it has the option to choose the base image for removing ghost effect at this point. Lightroom, on the other hand, will get here 1 additional point because here you can check that the areas in the images where the ghosting effect will take place in the images, you can be shown to you by an overlay. That's pretty cool, so you can determine where the tool or the application will determine ghost effect at this point. And last but not least, I think Photomatix should get 3 points in this category because it has most of the options. The ghosting can be done even locally, not over the whole image. You can mark the areas in the image where the ghosting effect should take place. You got a loop where you can view part of the image at a very high magnification. And of course, you got a lot of settings, and you have a couple of presettings from natural, realistic to very saturated images if you like that. Okay, now you have the winner. The winner is Photomatix, but if you use Lightroom or Luminar NEO, that isn't that bad, because the differences between the application here at this point are not that big, so you might as well be happy with a Lightroom Classic or Luminar HDR merge module. Okay, that was my comparison between the four tools I have here on my desktop PC or on my Macintosh. If you have any questions to this, you might as well place them in the comments to this video or in the comments to the corresponding blog posts. And if this video was a little bit helpful to you, you might think about placing a like on the video. And I surely would appreciate it if you subscribe my channel. But then don't forget to hit the bell so you get a notification every time I upload a new video. Okay, that was my HDR tool comparison, and all I have to say is till the next time, ciao, tux Oche.